If you would like to support the podcast, you can click the Buy Us a Coffee link on our show notes or on our website. Your support helps us keep the podcast going, and we appreciate each of our listeners so much.
You can also rate and review us on Apple and Spotify, follow us on social media, and don't forget to tell your friends and family about us. I'm Darlene.
And I'm Melody.
This is
Hard Times and True Crimes.
Euthanasia is the painless killing of a patient suffering from an incurable and painful disease. And the practice is illegal in most countries. The controversy of euthanasia is first and foremost a moral concern. The main moral objection to it is that our life is given to us by a creator and is not ours to take. The idea of playing God on one's own behalf has long been seen as wrong, and in medical fields, the Hippocratic Oath would seem to point to an assumed moral boundary. First, do no harm. However, there have long been those who would disagree, and the debate has played out over and over again throughout the centuries. The new term for it is medical assistance in dying. On one side is the belief that life is from God, and to shorten or prolong it is not trusting in His plan. And another point is that suffering has a purpose, and to divert from it is to refuse His work in a man's life. Even St. Thomas Aquinas condemned suicide as a violation of God's authority. On the other side are those who would argue that to aid a patient in their death is to grant dignity and mercy, and it's where the term mercy killing came from. Public support for euthanization, or mercy killing, began to increase during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and then it fell away in the aftermath of World War II, when people saw the horrors this idea could result in when taken to its extreme. And then in 1990s, Jack Kevorkian, aka Dr. Death, became one of the most well-known supporters of assisted suicide in the U.S. when he videotaped himself administering a lethal injection to one of his consenting patients who could not do the deed himself. This was illegal, and therefore he was sentenced to 8 years for second-degree homicide. Since then, several countries in Europe have changed their law allowing for it, and in the U.S. it is now legal in 11 states. But is it right? Whose choice is it really? And what if loved ones begin to feel an obligation to end their own life when they feel they've become a burden to their families, or that their care is too costly? What about the question of being able to die with dignity and without pain? The same questions still remain, but one thing is for sure. The story you will hear today will make you question your beliefs about it.
Okay, so this morning we went to Uwharrie Mercantile in Troy, North Carolina for our coffee. And that is the coolest place.
Yes, it is. And if you are local to us, you have got to go check them out.
Yes, even if you're in Asheboro, it's totally worth the drive.
Mm-hmm. We found out some very interesting history about the place. It used to be a tuberculosis sanatorium way back in the day. And later on became a pharmacy for many years.
Yep.
A hotel, the Troy Hotel.
Yes.
And now it's the Mercantile.
Super cool.
And they are our sponsors for today.
Yes. I had a caramel bourbon latte.
What'd you think about it?
It's really good.
Yes. I actually had the Carolina Gold Rush, and I chose it strictly because I liked the name. But it is delicious. I didn't do any sugar in that. And sometimes I don't really like coffee without the sugar because, I need something to cut that bitterness. But this coffee was so smooth that it was good. It is. It's very good.
They have a high quality coffee.
We want to give a shout out to Dana for supporting our show and for providing our coffee for us this morning. we plan to go talk to her again because she had a rather interesting story to tell us that we would like to share on the podcast sometime in the future.
Yes. Okay, so let's talk about some of the differences we're seeing in our skin since we went over to see Tasha Briles at Lakeside Integrative.
Yes, so we talked about it a little bit on our last episode, right after we had it done. So now we're over a week out now.
Yeah.
And so, I actually am seeing some differences for sure.
Oh, yeah,
my
me
skin,
too.
now that the initial sloughing process has finished, everything is looking brighter and lighter, and I'm loving it.
Me too. I feel like my skin is so glowy and fresh.
Yes. And tell them what the name of the process that we had done.
Okay, so we actually had the total skin solution, which is complete solution. So we had the micro needling.
Yes.
And then we also had the laser resurfacing. There's, of course, a ton of benefits. The glowing skin.
And these are just the results we're seeing initially, but they said over the next couple or few weeks, it's going to continue to get better and better.
Yes. I mean, it's basically like a non-surgical facelift.
Yeah.
Is what it is. You and I have both seen results over at Lakeside of people who have had that done, and there is a remarkable difference.
Definitely.
It's incredible. But yeah, my skin just looks and feels so nice. And then I also had the laser hair removal. In the first few days, I was like, oh, because there was still like a little bit of stuff there. I mean, it's crazy.
I was going to ask.
So nice. Yes. It's like, it was really getting like, I felt like sprouting hair was my new superpower.
Thanks, perimenopause.
Exactly. So it's awesome. Like not to have stubble there anymore.
That's good to know.
So yeah. And like I said, I'll have 2 more treatments. So what little bit didn't get, what they didn't get in the first treatment, they'll be able to get in the next couple.
Okay. So we will keep you updated as we continue to have our next 2.
Yes. And so if you want to, this fall, if you're wanting to have some nice glowy skin after you've been sun tanning
right
all summer long, I would really suggest you go over and see Tasha Briles at Lakeside Integrative, and you'll get to meet Mandy and you'll get to meet Chelsea, and it's just a great place.
Yes. Okay, so before I do my episode today, I do want to give you an update on one of the episodes I did recently. It was episode 26 about Gretchen Harrington.
Yes.
I've been following that one closely. And when I left at the end of that episode, and I don't want to give spoilers, so if you haven't listened yet, you may want to not listen to this part. At the end of that episode, the man that they had arrested for that they had arrested him in Georgia, and they were trying to get him extradited back to Pennsylvania, where this crime took place. And he was fighting that, trying to avoid it.
Right.
But they actually have extradited him back to Delaware County, Pennsylvania. He had a preliminary arraignment, and now he's waiting a preliminary hearing there, which is scheduled for October 11th.
Oh, good.
So by the time you hear this episode, that should be taking place. I will keep you updated as to the results of that as it goes. But that's it's going to continue to develop.
Yes.
And I just want to keep people updated.
I'm so anxious to know if there were more victims.
Me too. I really want to know what's going to come from this case.
Hopefully we can get some more murder solved or,
Answers.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we want to see justice take place there.
Absolutely. And I would love to hear a statement from his family.
Yeah.
But, I feel bad for them, but I still would like to know how they feel.
Right. For my episode today, we're going to go across the pond to Europe. Mm-hmm. And so just a heads up, the pronunciation of some of these names and places, I'm just going to pronounce them as we would say them here. They will probably not be the way that they would be said over there. And I will do my best not to butcher them.
Melody knows this because her and her family went across the pond last year.
Mm-hmm. At this time, we were there last year at this time.
Yeah. So they were in Germany, and tell them everywhere you went.
Oh, goodness. We, Scotland, England, France, Germany, Austria, Italy, Switzerland, and went through Iceland.
Wow. Trip of a lifetime.
It really was. That was a bucket list. For sure.
Awesome.
Yes. And so I learned a little bit of stuff here and there. So it was kind of exciting to do an episode from over there. But again, I don't speak the language very well. So if you are listening from Austria, Germany today, then just know I'm doing my best with the names. Waltraud, Wagner, which I'm pretty sure over there would be pronounced Wagner. Waltraud Wagner was born in 1960 into a somewhat large family in a rural part of Austria. By a large family, I mean she was like one of 6 children.
Okay.
Large by today's standards.
Yeah.
Her mother had to work the fields, so when Waltraud was a child, she and her siblings, they kind of fended for themselves. They had to take care of the house, just stuff like that. And so when she was just 12 years old, she found herself being a caretaker of her elderly grandma. And one of her responsibilities was tending the open sores on her grandma's legs.
Oh, bless her heart.
Yeah, I mean, that's not going to be a pleasant task for anybody, but imagine being 12 years old and having to deal with that. Not easy. With this experience under her belt, though, it's no surprise that when Waltraud grew up, she ended up in the nursing field. She had not been an especially good student in school. In fact, she struggled when she took the nursing program. It was a 2-year program, and she ultimately flunked out of that because she wasn't able to pass the anatomy section.
That's actually a really hard program, though.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But all was not lost. She was still able to find work as a nurse's aide.
Okay.
I mean, after all, just like today, many of the hospitals were short-staffed. Getting nursing help was not easy. So they needed nursing aides as well. And this was a way for her to get her foot in the door.
Yeah.
The nurses who were employed were overworked, and many found themselves relying on those aides to even do some of their jobs for them. And sometimes those jobs were not things they were really licensed to do, but, you have to make do with what you have.
Right.
And I think it's that way today. Sometimes the hospitals get overcrowded, understaffed, and you make do to do what you can. Mm-hmm. Any nurses out there will totally understand that.
Right. Especially
after COVID.
Yeah.
For sure. So, in 1983, at the age of 23, Waltraud was working at Lane's General Hospital in Vienna, Austria, as a nurse's aide. She worked the night shift, or as some call it, the graveyard shift. And she worked on Pavilion 5. Now, that was a section that was reserved for elderly patients over 70. Usually, or many times, they were terminally ill, or maybe they had an especially problematic case, or they were hard cases is what they were. And because of that understaffing issue, she did find herself doing the job of a nurse many times with stuff that maybe she had not actually been trained for.
Right. She wasn't really qualified.
Right. On one of these busy night shifts, Waltraud found herself caring for an elderly patient who had been suffering terribly. And at age 77, this patient, she was just ready to die. Mm-hmm. And so she begged Waltraud to help her do that.
Oh, like an assisted suicide situation? Okay.
Well, Wagner, she practically had full access to an unlocked medicine cabinet. There was just not enough people to give oversight, especially on the night shift. Many of the aides were able to go in there and get what they needed. There was not a lot of documentation. There was a lot of inaccuracies in the documentation. It was not hard for her to do.
Right.
And even one time, Wagner had seen a nurse administer some morphine for pain to a patient. So she knew what the approximate dosage was. And she also knew how much to give that would be too much. Mm-hmm. And she knew that was going to end her patient's suffering. And so, she's running around like a chicken with her head cut off, as we would say, trying to keep up with her numerous patients that she has to deal with. So it didn't take her much to be convinced, and she decided she was going to help her patient. And so she issued her a lethal dose of morphine in what she called an act of mercy.
Yeah, I was going to say, she was probably able to convince herself that was an act of mercy.
And I like that your choice of words there, convince herself. Well, Wagner may not have expected her own response to the mercy killing, but a feeling of power washed over her. She realized she could, in essence, play God. If she felt nervous about being found out, it quickly dissipated because she realized there's no reason that anybody's going to question this death. After all, most or many of the patients on Pavilion 5 died before going home. They didn't make it home. They died anyway. The method of that patient's death went unnoticed.
Right.
There was just no reason to question it. And that actually emboldened her a little bit.
Okay. These poisoners, too, they get a taste for death.
Right. They do. So Waltraud Wagner, she did. She felt a thrill at being able to decide the fate of her patients. And before long, she was able to convince other nursing assistants to help her.
Oh, my goodness.
It became almost like a sick game. She recruited 3 other aides. Maria Gruber, who was age 19. She was also a nursing school dropout and an unwed mother. Stefania Mayer. She was age 43, so she was kind of the oldest of these group of ladies, and she was a divorced grandmother, and I believe she was an immigrant from Yugoslavia. And then lastly, there was Irene Ladoff, who was age 21. She was married, but she kind of preferred her girls' nights out with her friends and just hanging out at the tavern or whatever.
She didn't act married?
Not really.
Okay.
And she would actually go on to become Wagner's main helper in what took place. All of a sudden, we have a crime ring. This group of ladies, I'm not going to call them ladies, this group of women began dishing out their own version of death by lethal injection. Sometimes they would inject the patients with other drugs like insulin or Rohypnol. These were no mercy killings. They, all of a sudden, if a patient's being ornery, maybe not taking their medicine easily, refusing their meds, or soiling the bed, or just calling the nurses too many times and getting on their nerves, they would be taken care of real quick.
That's terrible.
It is terrible. It gets worse. And of course, as time progressed, the women became even more prone to murdering the very patients they were supposed to be caring for. They actually joked about it, calling it giving this patient a ticket straight to God. If she calls you and she's kind of hard to get along with, I'm going to give her a ticket to God tonight. And they would plan, okay, we're going to do it the next shift.
Wow.
It became a sadistic game.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't take long for Wagner to come up with a more sadistic method of killing her patients. I'm going to give a graphic warning here. This what I'm getting ready to tell you is like, it's hard to believe that anybody can be this sadistic. I mean, I know it, but it's hard to wrap my mind around it, and it's going to be a little graphic.
Okay.
She called this the water cure.
Oh.
Have you ever heard this?
No.
She would have her assistants hold the head and pinch the nose of the patient and would press down their tongue while she would pour or force water down their throat until it filled up their lungs, causing them to drown.
That is awful.
It is awful. It was a slow and agonizing death. Horrifying.
Just the fact that as a human being, you could watch another human being suffer like that. I couldn't watch an animal suffer like that.
Right.
Oh,
I know.
That's heartbreaking.
And these are elderly patients who they can't fight back.
Right. They're defenseless.
And the perfect part of this plan is that it would go undetected because many elderly patients do die with fluid in their lungs.
Right. Like that congestive
heart failure. So again, there was no reason for that to raise any questions. So now they're not just injecting them with these overdoses of drugs, but they are torturing these people with this water cure.
That's unbelievable.
It is really hard to understand, like just the pure evilness that you could do that.
Mm-hmm.
To take such delight in torturing a child or an elderly person or just anybody who's helpless.
It reminds me, though, of that verse that says that sin will take you further than you want to go. I'm sure in the beginning, she never, you know what I mean? She probably couldn't have imagined taking measures like that. But it really does. It desensitizes you.
Right. It started with somebody begging her to help them.
Right.
And then it escalated into this.
Mm-hmm.
And then the more, I think, too, like what you're saying, you almost become calloused to it.
Right. And then maybe obviously, I think, derive some pleasure from it.
Right. Because then because now she's feeling a thrill from it.
Mm-hmm.
This is just how, I don't know, just how evil it is that it became for them. Not only did they commit these just heinous acts against these people, but then later they would rehash it between themselves and laugh about it, how the patient had resisted and fought and, how alarmed they were. And they got this twisted, demented satisfaction out of that.
God,
Can you even?
No, I just keep thinking, but there's a special place in hell.
There is. I fully believe that.
Yeah.
Especially for anybody, again, that would harm a defenseless person, like a child or an elderly person. And then on top of that, get such pleasure and laugh about it.
Yeah. I was just reading again in the Bible the other day about how God loves justice. He loves mercy and he loves justice.
He does. This is just a short side story, but when my grandmother was still living, she stayed at a rest home here locally, and she got beat up.
Oh,
It was so sad because my grandma was the sweetest little lady ever. She lived to be 101, and she was in her late 90s when this happened. But see, she couldn't hear, and she could barely see, and she could barely hear. And so she couldn't tell anybody who did it. And we don't know if it was one of the workers or another resident, but they came in her room and they beat her up, and it was so sad.
That is unbelievable.
And of course, the people that worked there were saying they had no idea what happened, but somebody knew what happened.
Yes.
And I don't know, but it was just so sad to us.
Oh, I can't imagine. That breaks my heart.
No, it broke our hearts.
I worked at a place also here in this county that, just very briefly when I was in my early 20s, and one of my coworkers beat up an elderly lady.
Oh.
And, I mean, elderly, she was bedridden, and this was a man.
Oh my
in
gracious.
his 30s.
That's horrible.
And I'm
Did he
talking
get fired?
punch in the face. Yeah, he did.
That is just...
I don't want to go to a nursing home.
I know, me either. Also, the one that my grandma was at when that happened, that's also the same one that just a year or two ago, they found an elderly patient outside in the snow that had frozen to death.
I'm wondering if it's the same place I worked at.
I don't know. After the episode, we're going to have to talk about that a little more.
Are.
I'm going to call my mama and ask her for more details.
Okay.
So again, just the thought that anybody could hurt somebody like that is just, to me, that's just another level of evil.
It is.
Well, the longer these women went undetected, the more confident they became and less careful about covering their tracks. But it did take years for people in the hospital to start noticing. But they did notice that eventually that when Wagner would be on leave, fewer patients were dying. And it kind of became a rumor among the staff that the angel of death prevailed when Nurse Wagner was on duty.
Okay.
Suddenly, around 1987, the number of elderly deaths had an uptick. Almost 100 patients between 87 and 89.
Oh my gosh.
That's a lot. So you can see them becoming just more and more brazen. So in 1988, there was another nursing assistant, and she noticed that some things weren't quite right, that several patients had died just after receiving a tranquilizer. So she kind of just made a mental note that she was going to pay closer attention to the drug closet. And sure enough, she did notice some discrepancies in what was being taken. So she notified her bosses.
Good.
They looked into it, but they didn't find anything right away. So I don't know if they brushed it off at that point or not,
right.
But they did start getting some other people mentioning things. So in 1989, the chief physician on staff, Dr. Franz Penzendorfer, he became suspicious. He started running checks on the medicine chest, and he noticed that large quantities of Rohypnol and insulin were not accounted for. But he didn't actually act quickly enough on that information. Eventually, he was actually, after all of this kind of came to a head, he was charged with negligence, and he was suspended from duty over his reluctance to act on that.
Because he may have been just trying to
wait it out and see if there was proof.
But at the same time, I guess there's lives on the line when you're waiting out something like that.
Right. However, once he did finally act, the hospital, they decided they were going to test the blood of one of their patients who had recently passed. And there was a rather large amount of tranquilizer found in the blood work, way more than should be expected. So police were contacted, and they did open an investigation. Unfortunately, by the time an autopsy was performed, there was none of the tranquilizer left in the blood.
No.
So on that autopsy report, the cause of death was listed as pulmonary embolism. That investigation was closed. Hospital staff moved on. And I think the hospital was kind of a little bit negligent themselves.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
And again, they're doing that water cure. So there's no way to really test for that.
Right.
They're still overdosing some patients. I guess it just depends on what is handy at the moment.
Gotcha.
Do you have somebody to help you hold this patient's head down? Okay, we'll do this. If I'm by myself, I'll just give them an overdose. They're using various methods, but one of them really can't be detected later. The drugs can eventually. It finally came to a head in February of 1989 One patient in Pavilion 5 was being difficult. Julia Drapel refused her meds that night, and while she was arguing with her caretaker, she called Wagner a common slut.
Oh,
yes.
okay.
And
I think I know what's coming.
You can get a little ornery when you're old and you're sick and you're tired and you don't feel good. They can get a little grouchy.
Yes.
So Wagner decided she was getting a ticket to God through the water cure.
Oh.
I know, it's just
That's
heartbreaking.
Barbaric.
It is barbaric. After her shift was over, the women, they decided they were going to go to their local tavern and unwind over some drinks. And they're sitting there rehashing that event. And they are describing what they did to this poor lady named Julia. And they're mocking her and laughing about it. And they're not even trying to hide it or be quiet. But what they didn't know is that there was a man sitting nearby who was also a doctor. And he overheard some snippets of their conversation. And he heard enough to alarm him. And he went straight to the authorities.
Good.
Yeah. Another investigation was quickly opened. This investigation went on for 6 weeks. So now authorities are watching closely, unbeknownst to these nurses or nurses' aides. In March of 1989, so about 4 weeks after they started watching them, 71-year-old Franz Frey went into a coma from an insulin overdose. What made that more suspicious is that he was not even diabetic, so he shouldn't have any insulin in the first place.
Right.
That was a little bit of proof for them.
Okay.
And 3 weeks later, another patient also mysteriously had an insulin overdose. Who was on shift during both of those insulin overdoses? Wagner and Meyer. So after 6 weeks, in April of 1989, authorities finally had enough proof to make arrest of the nurses. The other 3 aides, Gruber, Meyer, and Ladoff, quickly pointed to Wagner as the ringleader of their operation. Now, surprisingly, all 4 women confessed to their crimes.
Wow.
They admitted to over 50 killings.
Whoa. But there were more.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Wagner brazenly confessed to 39 of those deaths between 87 and 89, and she admitted that killing had become a habit for her.
Oh, my gosh.
Just actually being quite boastful about it.
Yeah.
Now, later, she would become a lot less boastful and then began to downplay the number of patients that she had murdered.
Whenever her consequences were.
When her lawyers probably said, you better shut up.
Yeah.
But before that, she was feeling a little arrogant about it and was, almost bragging. So later, she claimed that she had only done 10, and it was only to ease their pain, quote unquote.
Did they know at this point about the water, about the drownings?
Yes, those were in part of the confessions.
Oh, okay.
So their killing spree had actually lasted from 1983 to 1989. But those earlier killings, the ones that happened between 83 and 87, there was just not enough evidence that the earlier killings that had happened between 83 and 87, there just wasn't enough evidence for any of that because it was before they were being watched and being suspicious of them. And they hadn't confessed to any of those, so they didn't have anything to go on.
Right.
But prosecutors did estimate that the total murders were probably in the hundreds. I have seen some estimations of between 200 and 300. And I saw one that was said 400, but I couldn't find that anywhere else. Okay. So,
there were a lot.
There were a lot. They could only be charged with the ones that had proof or confessions for. So overall, they were charged with 42 murders, and they were actually tried together.
Huh.
That was interesting. The trial did not start until 1991. Now, during the trial, Wagner was the first to testify, and now she had a completely different demeanor.
Oh, I'm sure.
She was speaking quietly during the questions, sometimes barely audible. She admitted on the stand that she did give patients overdoses as an attempt to ease their pain. She claimed that she had once noticed that nurse give that Rohypnol to calm them. And so while she was on the night shift, when the nurses were overworked, she had to step in and sometimes help out. And so she was trying to calm the patient.
Okay. Yeah.
And she said, yes, sometimes she knew she gave too much, but, that was all for good reasons. And she also admitted to the water treatment, but now she's changed it to mouth care.
Huh?
I don't know. I guess she thought that sounded nicer than her water cure. And now she's trying to make it sound like it was done with empathy instead of malice.
You can't drown somebody with empathy.
Exactly. And then she actually broke down in sobs on the stand at one point and had to be led from the courtroom.
Ew.
I know. Now, their whole defense is just based on this mercy killing idea. And the defense for Wagner, his name was Wilhelm Philipp, he said his client wanted to help, and nothing but help. The prosecutors, they did actually have a tough job ahead, as their case was based mainly on the confessions, and some of those had been partially retracted before the trial. But during the trial, these women were compared to Nazis. Okay, and did you know that Adolf Hitler was actually from Austria?
No.
That was his birth home, was Austria. Okay. They knew these Nazis had employed similar methods and sadistic medical horrors at the death camps during World War II. And it's just that lack of reverence for human life.
Yeah.
That can allow you to kill somebody in such a barbaric way with no empathy at all.
Yeah.
So Europe, I mean, they were still dealing with the aftermath of the Nazi invasions from World War II, even as that trial was being held.
Wow. The whole time you were talking, I was actually thinking about those Nazi female guards.
Yes.
That I think they were actually executed because they were so brutal. But I was thinking of Irma Gries and Maria Mandel and that Herman Braunsteiner, I think her name was, or Hermione. I don't know how to say all the names, but they were so brutal, and they didn't start out that way, but you become desensitized to it, and then they become, these people become subhuman to you, and you feel like they enjoyed inflicting this pain on the prisoners.
It's just the way they took on that mindset that the elderly or the young or the disabled, anybody who was not perfect,
right?
How they did look at them as less than human.
Yeah.
And had no conscience about that.
No.
Thought they were doing right.
Right.
It's hard for us to really conceive of how that could come about, but it did.
It did. It's even worse than that because they were okay with torturing them. It's not like wishing that they didn't exist. It's like being okay with watching them suffer.
And we're not used to seeing women. We don't expect women to have that capacity.
Yes.
And yet, just like those women you mentioned back during the Nazi regime, and even, now 40 years later,
right,
during this event, this was a group of women.
Yeah. And that's why back in the old times, it was very hard for jurors to find female killers guilty because they always had an excuse for them.
Right.
You know what I mean? It wasn't just because they were sheer evil. It was they just couldn't fathom a woman, doing something like that. So it's interesting.
But we've seen time and time again that they definitely do.
Yeah, they're capable.
Of great evil.
Yes.
Well, after 18 days, prosecutor Ernest Kloiber wrapped up his case with these remarks. Society glorifies what is young, dynamic, innovative, and healthy. Sickness is already seen as a shame, death completely repressed. The old are forced to the edge of society by a dictatorship of the healthy. He told jurors they must send a clear signal that euthanasia is unacceptable.
Yes.
Now, Austria does not have the death penalty, so that was not even on the table.
That's a shame.
It is a shame. And life sentence is usually only 15 years. Can you imagine? I mean, we're just not used to that here in our country.
So is it 15 years and then they're up for parole, or 15 years and they're automatically released?
They're up for parole.
Okay.
Yes, I'm glad you asked because there is that distinction.
Okay.
So in March of 1991, after an 18-day trial and 17 hours of deliberation by the jury of 5 men and 3 women, the decisions were as such. Marie Gruber, who is now 29, she had pled not guilty, but she was found guilty of 2 attempted murders, and she was sentenced to 15 years in prison. She was able to get that reduced to 12 years after an appeal a year later.
Wow.
Stefania Mayer, who was age 51 now, she actually testified to helping Wagner with some of those murders that even Wagner had denied. Because, Wagner had kind of taken a step back.
Yes.
And I think she had done so many that she may not even have remembered them all.
Right.
So Stefania was convicted of 7 counts of attempted murder, 1 count of manslaughter, and she was sentenced to 20 years. Irene Ladoff, who was now 29, she was convicted on 5 counts of premeditated murders and sentenced to life in prison. And then lastly, Wagner, the mastermind herself, she had been accused of 32 counts. She was convicted on 15 counts of premeditated murder and 17 attempted murders.
Wow.
And 2 aggravated assaults. Now, the attempted murders, that makes me wonder, I did not read anywhere if she had given some overdoses that didn't take, but I wondered how they found that out.
Obviously, I mean, they must have had some
like.
evidence that that was the case.
Yeah.
And I wonder if those people spoke out against her and weren't believed originally.
Possibly. Oh, the thought of that. Oh. Mm-hmm. Well, of course, she was sentenced to life in prison as well. And interestingly enough, when they read her verdict, she collapsed and had to be given first aid.
Bless her heart.
Poor thing. Now, the other 3 defendants, they gave no reaction when they got their verdicts. But this criminal mastermind who had taken such satisfaction out of torturing others now is pronounced guilty and collapses.
And she's not even, I mean, she's going to get to escape being tortured herself.
Right.
Which I think is also a shame.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, you may be tempted to think that even though there was no death penalty, that at least they are going to spend the rest of their lives in prison.
Yeah.
Well, you're going to be wrong about that. In 2008, Austrians were once again outraged when they read reports in a weekly magazine called News that told how Maria Gruber and Stefania Meyer had been released, and they had been given new identities to protect against possible vigilantes.
Wow.
And even had, prior to being released, been allowed to leave the prison on day trips for months, going to get their hair done and shop and that kind of thing. It was all part of a pre-release program.
That's unbelievable.
It really is. Now, the Austrians didn't care for that either. And even though they didn't have the death penalty and stuff, they knew that that wasn't right. That these women should not have been so easily allowed to enjoy regular life. And imagine how furious they were when Ladoff and Wagner both were also released in 2008 for good behavior. Now, I probably had come up for parole after 15 years and were denied that first time. So they did serve 17 years.
Good. But
it was not enough.
No.
And even the fellow Austrians agreed that was not enough. And for good behavior, I'm sorry, but no, that's a free pass for you. You don't get a pass for good behavior. And there was even no mention of whether those other 2 got new identities or not. I imagine they probably did, but that makes you mad because now they're out in the public again and
probably working nursing jobs.
Very easily could be a caretaker for an elderly person. Like, I don't trust that at all.
No. And people like that typically do go right back into those professions. I was just reading about somebody just recently, and not only did they go back into that same profession, but they killed again, like 2 or 3 more times before being caught. And then they had to spend the rest of their life in prison after 3 more people lost their lives.
Yeah, see, they never should have been out the first time. That is such a shame.
I mean, they've proved. How many murders was it?
She was charged with like 37 different murders.
That's insane.
Yeah, and numerous accounts of attempted murder. I mean, it was unreal.
Yeah.
Well, this whole injustice did raise the question in the minds of the Austrians of the morality of euthanasia. It kind of brought that whole issue up into the forefront of their minds.
Right.
And this quote from the state attorney's office sums it up, I think. It says, "It's a small step from killing the terminally ill to the killing of insolent, burdensome patients, and from there to that which was known under the Third Reich as euthanasia. It is a door that must never be opened again."
Yeah, okay, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was
sad that we have to even be having this discussion.
Right.
Wow, those sure were some hard times.
They sure were.
Those ladies at Hard Times and True Crimes sure do make you think. And I thought one feller helping another feller kill himself would have been called something like murdercide. I thought a story about euthanasia would have had more to do with teenagers in North Korea. And I thought that Kevorkian is what they called the offspring of a Klingon and a Vulcan in Star Trek Episode 9. If you want a guarantee to never be confused by your own thoughts, you make sure you download every episode of Hard Times and True Crimes. And tell everybody you know, and a few people you don't, to check us out. Till next time, goodbye.